Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, Elven Warrior of the contemporary American intellectual scene. Friend of the pod, Blake Smith, is back for today's episode, which is one of my once-a-month paid episodes. So if you're not a paid subscriber, you'll get only the first 20 minutes or so. They're a great 20 minutes, but then the next 40 or so is also amazing. I mean, it's so good, you don't want to miss it. I didn't quite intend it this way, but my brain is at where my brain is at. And so my conversation with Blake turned out to be another installment in the informal series of post-mortems I seem to be conducting on the heterodox moment in the early 2020s, when there coalesced a loose collection of critics of wokeness who still, in some fundamental sense, identified with the left. And I think Blake was in that group much more than I was. It's kind of came late to writing about that stuff, but I identify with it in some way. So we talk about, what did we think we were doing? Was it worth it? Did it help anyone? Did we get the balance right? Did it change anything? Or was it all just kind of masturbatory? Or was it masturbatory, but that was fine anyway, because beauty, intellectual curiosity, and vibing with one's sense of vocation are sufficient ends in themselves. Maybe our job as writers is not even to think about what's strategic or impactful, but Blake and I kind of go back and forth on it and sort of explore our different perspectives. We also talk about Blake's ongoing project on Michael Denneny, the pioneering gay editor and theorist who worked with Hannah Arendt for a while and became one of the central figures in post-Stonewall gay intellectual life. For Blake, Denneny's career has become, he's interested in Denneny on his own terms, but it's also become a way for Blake to think about what a queer identity politics could look like in the mold that I think Blake sees Denneny as laying down, which is that it's deeply rooted in a shared identity in the way that we typically think of with identity politics. But it's different in the sense that it leverages that shared experience of the sort of community with its definite and sort of definitive boundaries, but it uses it to open up, to allow for more space for conversation and disputation than may typically be the case in what we tend to think of as identity politics. So it's, what unites people is the shared identity, but then that kind of opens up to all sorts of political possibilities that don't necessarily adhere to the typical right-left binaries that structure so much of our cultural and political disputes and conversations. We talk about other things as well. I always love talking to Blake. He's a blast. And unlike our last podcast conversation when his audio was super wonky, we both sound good on this one, so that's a good thing too. I hope you enjoy not the next episode, but next month's paid episode will be with Freddie DeBoer, famous, notorious lightning rod Freddie DeBoer. He comes up briefly in my conversation with Blake. So I'm really looking forward to that one too. I have been a Freddie DeBoer watcher and an occasional one-way communicator with Freddie. In other words, I send him emails and mostly he doesn't respond, but I have a lot of thoughts on him and I'm always interested in what he has to say, so I'm looking forward to that conversation too. Various other great ones coming up, but I hope you enjoy this one with Blake. Peace. Blake, welcome back to the podcast. You were reanointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by the cranky and slightly pervy ghost of Harold Bloom. I have 3 things I want to talk to you about today, Blake.
Let it be known to the listener, I'm going in with zero prep.
Right. Here are the 3 things. This essay you just wrote and published in Tablet on Harold Bloom and Hart Crane, there's an aside near the top in which you say something ruefully about how you thought for a while it might be useful to try and develop your sort of idiosyncratic critique of wokeness that didn't partake of the sins of the sort of other critiques of wokeness.
What I do has class to it. That's my self-branding.
Right. But now you think maybe that was not as useful as you thought it was. So I kind of want to talk about that, your sort of reflection on yourself in that period, and also just sort of more broadly, like looking back from the vantage point of, what is it, 2 years? It's not a long time to when we all thought that was a useful thing.
Yeah. Because I feel like this is sort of congruent to some of the thoughts that you've had over the past several months or year, where obviously if one had known that Trump would have won, then any number of priorities would have been shifted, because now I see the premier independent movie theater in Chicago still has a very long land acknowledgement that fades in paragraph by paragraph. So it really takes a full 90 seconds. And I used to roll my eyes. I used to think, but now I think, I'm so glad they have that. Let them enjoy. But we may not have human rights. We may not have the rule of the law, but if these people want their land acknowledgement, God bless them.
We still have the indie movie theaters
right.
in blue cities, right? The third thing, which is I think is kind of connected, which is something I think I need to do more of on my show just because it'd be interesting, which is who and what are you into these days? Like I think I need to start asking people if they were the host of my podcast, if they were the host of their own podcast that did exactly the same thing where they're trying to stay in touch with the hip intellectual currents of the moment and the people, who would they be reading?
That's right. So you have the guest curate your guest list for you.
Exactly.
This is the
Yeah. So, I mean, let's go, but let's start with looking back. I mean, let me see. Maybe I should just read this. Where's that thing that you wrote? Okay, here you go. This is sort of the preamble to the actual essay, right? This is your Substack post. So you wrote, if a few years ago it seemed to me, and then in parentheses, perhaps now clearly wrongly, useful or at least interesting to try to articulate a thinking about liberalism and a critique of wokeness that were, I hoped, novel, raucous, peculiar, queer, etc., parentheses, that resisted, in other words, the sort of tepid, boring centrism, the hemming and hawing, the performance of a politesse specific to a narrow class of elite but superficial culture and distance from passion that liberalism, blah, 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 whatever. How did you just put it a second ago? Your critique that was like a classier version of
so I say this. This is probably not straight male culture, but I love there are these YouTube compilations of videos that are like titled "Divas on Divas, Divas versus Divas." It's just like multiple hours of clips from the last 30, 40 years of like pop girls like shading each other. One of them that I really cherish is like early 90s Janet Jackson is being asked about how she thinks of what she does in relation to like Madonna's music. And she's, very vexed by this question because this is like the height of Madonna's like BDSM inspired like erotica stuff. So Madonna's being like very, very transgressive, very bad girl. And Janet is like, well, it's also dance music, I'll say that. But I think what I do, how shall I put this, has class to it. And, that's how I always think about myself in relation to like centrist, liberal, neoconservative, whatever. Like, why am I not in Liberties? Other than that they didn't like my pitches, but also like why am I not clubbable? I don't know. I'm choosing to frame it as what I do has class to it. That's the difference.
Let's explore that after if we get back to it. What are you thinking now? So you have this parenthetical, perhaps now clearly wrongly. You thought it was useful to articulate a critique of wokeness. And I guess put aside for the moment whether your critique was classier than other critiques and whether that's a meaningful distinction or not. And just in a sense, assume that your motives were the same as the rest of us. Anti-wokeness left liberals who thought it was worthwhile for some period of time to articulate a critique of wokeness.
Yeah. So, I mean, the universe from Barry Weiss to Becca Rothfeld, like this sort of.
Right. What were you thinking then and why do you regret it?
Yeah. To live is to regret. I mean, what is getting older for, if not to? But my, I guess, wish to be critiquing wokeness, like from 2020 for those couple of years on, grew in part out of my friendship with a couple of women who were working in the culture industry, like good friends of mine. One was working at kind of humanities NGO doing programming, and the other was working at a big museum of contemporary art. And both of these spaces went completely fucking insane. And I hate to now sound like a very boring Republican, like raking through like, these horror stories, but they really were like both of them did intensive, months-long, kind of weird therapeutic group sessions where like all the employees get together and bring an object that symbolizes how you relate to race in America. And this like weird counselor who will be brought in from the outside will like explain to you how you ought to be feeling about race. And we're going to do an internal audit and produce a 1,000-page document about like the historic misdoings of our institution and try to be better and blah, 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 blah. And like, one of them recorded one of these sessions like secretly for my benefit. It was insane. And I think throughout academia, even less than like these other NGOs, but throughout the kind of like culture industry and the institutions that are supposed to be performing like left liberal thoughtfulness, there were many, many such cases. And it just seemed like the moral transformation that was happening really suddenly in these kind of places and affecting my friends' lives seemed like totally insane. And I wanted to get a handle on that. And then the particular kind of political policy issues that wokeness ended up being wrapped around were like, for a period of time, it seemed like to be on the left is to be for no policing, to be for immediate child sex transition, and to be for open borders. This is what being on the left is, right? And I wanted to be able to say, like, both what was happening in a micro level, like in my friends' lives, and then what was happening in a broader political way on the left, that could be resisted or questioned or whatever through the canon of grad school theory that I had come up with. To say, no, not this. Like I can do that through actually a reading of Judith Butler. Like I can do that through Foucault. And I don't have to become a neo-Aristotelian Catholic, right? Or I don't have to give up the tradition of critical theory. I mean, this is also how a lot of critical theory people, even in '68, felt. They felt skeptical about the student radicals. And to express that skepticism doesn't mean giving up on their own intellectual formation. It certainly seemed like the moral transformation that was happening seemed very sudden and frightening. And it seemed useful to be trying to slow it down or at least model what questioning of it could look like. Now, retrospectively, it seems like it was a total flash in the pan. It's in some ways as if it had never happened. It doesn't seem to have been worth getting worried about. It was the left threw a sort of silly tantrum and empowered the return of Trump. And that was bad, but me critiquing it didn't do anything.
There's two kind of fairly distinct angles that I want to interrogate that with. And one of them is the sort of political strategic question. So part of what you're saying is I thought this was maybe a politically useful endeavor in some way to try and push back against this stuff, but also rhetorically to push back against this stuff in a way that was not as easily caricatured as just kind of right-wing, know nothing, transphobic, whatever, racist bullshit, right? So if I'm citing Foucault and Judith Butler and
I mean, I might also be transphobic and racist, but it's going to be French. It's going to be a little
well, right. But it's not going to be as easy to group you in with those people, right? And so there's the question, was it politically useful? But then, and this is contained in that thing of yours that I was reading out loud, which is you say useful or at least interesting. So then there's just this sort of, I was going to call it an aesthetic question, but it's almost really like a vocational question. What is it we're doing as writers and what constitutes sort of justification for what we're doing? So I found it fascinating. That's how in a lot of ways, I came to you. You wrote all of these kind of fascinating essays, many, but not all of them for tablet, reading against the grain of various figures. Sometimes it's, people who are identified as left-wing, but often, I think there was an interesting Leo Strauss one or two. And there were all of these different figures where you're reading sort of conservatives in these interesting lights. Maybe there was even a Bronze Age pervert or something like that.
So, reading Bronze Age pervert, reading Philip Reith and trying to make them look, Reith especially, more liberal, more capacious, interesting, more friendly.
So I loved reading all this stuff. I want to get into the political question, but there's part of me that wants to be well, who gives a shit if it was useful or not? It seemed like you were having fun writing it, and I had a lot of fun reading it. Surely you don't really think it wasn't interesting. Do you really think it was not worthwhile?
Oh my God. Things can be interesting and regrettable. That's most of
Well, let's disaggregate that. So was it was interesting to you? It felt generative.
Yeah.
I just can't believe that it didn't, because reading it felt that way. So I can't believe that writing it didn't.
I think especially at the time it felt, I ended up mostly writing for, what I would characterize at the time as center-right. I don't know how one would characterize tablet now, where, there was sort of a double wish to maybe speak to conservatives at a moment where 2020, 2022, when Trump was in abeyance, it seemed and maybe this was also a dumb fantasy, but it seemed like maybe those people were confused, were on the ropes, were willing to rethink some things. And so, maybe that was a moment to, for instance, at American Affairs, I tried to make an argument engaging and critiquing Chris Rufo to say, if you're really concerned about the woke takeover of academia, if people had more worker protection, if they felt safer at their jobs, they would be less vulnerable to these kind of mandatory cultural political performances. And, he sent me sort of an unhinged email, no hello, no subject line. It was just, so what do you think we should do then? ? And I guess that opened, it didn't go anywhere, but there was a potential for dialogue with it, right? So there's that wish, and then also maybe a wish to tell people on the left the theoretical formations that we came up with, people who went to grad school or who went to, like a nice undergrad and majored in theory. We don't have to jettison these, and these precisely might lead us to be a bit skeptical of, I think, from a Foucauldian or a Buthlerian perspective, like child's sex transition, like, question mark. And Butler themselves was thinking that in the 90s. And that's okay, right? I mean, like, people might disagree about that, but like that, it's permitted from within the tradition.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think the sense that like this sort of grad school left theory stuff like is a tradition, that I think it's valuable, that I want to hang on to it, even the parts that I think are like crazy and awful. I mean, in a way, I was in a similar space to Jeff Schellenberger, who's obviously been a lot more successful at it in the last few years. And at the time, I felt like, like we both, we think like sort of post-Marxist grad school theory, like this is valuable, and it shouldn't be shunted off into like believe science, believe women, like these kind of weird injunctions coming out of the left, which like seem to really lack criticality.
That's actually kind of bringing us back more into the sort of usefulness question, which I do want to get to, but I want to get to the life of the writer and what we
did I have fun?
You said regret. Like, I don't think I regret anything I wrote that was good. I regret things I wrote that were bad. It's hard for me to imagine a writer and somebody of a certain sort, and I would put you in this category, who like regrets good shit they were writing.
I mean, maybe this is a religious difference. I don't know. I regret everything, right? I mean, that's part of the fun, isn't it? Like, isn't that part of the fun of like, you do something bad, and of course you wanted to do it, and on some level you think that like you ought to do it, like that's, but
I think my ex-Catholic wife would have more to share with you on that psychosexual continuum than I do. Yeah.
I hope this makes it into the book. That sounds hot.
We'll see how much we want to share. Yeah. So anyway, you do regret it?
I don't yet know what my specific regret is. What do I wish that I had done with that time, other than like literally anything? But I guess, I mean, from a professional perspective, it was not very good at like leading me into, a well-paying, secure job, or even like what exactly is my audience? Like, who is my public?
Yeah, but I mean, fine, Blake, but like, you mean as opposed to now when you're writing about Michael Denneny,
right, even more,
as opposed to this super pragmatic mercenary approach you're taking? Come on, like who are we kidding here? Like, not that I'm not saying you don't wrestle with how to be somewhat pragmatic about building a career, but that doesn't pass the kind of sniff test of like, because you're not doing it now.
Right. I mean, I'm doing it even less now. I'm on hiatus from political topics. I mean, the Bloom thing, which I wrote like a year ago, I mean, I guess is actually quite like literary and small and obscure. But at the time, I was like, the state of America. I will address this on the eve of the election. And now I'm really not thinking about like big political topics. I wish it had all. I mean, I wish Kamala had won.
Right. Me too. Me too. Let's all stipulate.
Because in part, like, then I would, I think, have a better conscience about, prodding the left or flirting with the right or whatever. That was actually fine. That was, not damaging. I mean,
part of me wants to just ask you to join me in the easy response to that, the easy way out of that, which is that the excesses of the left handed the election to Trump, right? So that part of what we were doing was trying to mitigate some of that stuff on the left so that it was more likely that Kamala would be elected and less likely that Trump would be elected. I think that is true, but I would put to you, in addition to that, or apart from that, another case for the utility of this, which is that if you look back at, one of the, I think, the most compelling critiques of the moment, wokeness, whatever we want to call it. And this is kind of, I think, what Freddie de Boer's book was saying. This is what Musa Al-Gharbi's book was saying, which is that the left had energy and money and momentum and no real program.
Although that ever thus. So, I've been thinking about you, in fact, because I've been reading through the archive of N+1, and so I'm like up to 2011. And my God, I mean, the left was handed this historic opportunity that it will never have again, where everyone was sick of the Republicans' bullshit. Everyone was sick of like the Iraq War, of like all of the laissez-faire capitalist shit that had enabled the financial crisis, the housing crisis. Obama comes in, and the N+1 people are sort of indicative of the left's inability to seize this moment. And, they're kvetching and they're ironizing, and they're very aware that they're unable to seize the moment. However bad Trump fucks up this time, I don't think it will result in the kind of electoral sweep and shift in public opinion that like Obama came in on. Like that was really generational. And they fucked that one up. So I mean, and they've been and like pretty much every issue of like the first 12, which is as far as I've gotten, will have some essay being like, given how bad things are, given the financial crisis, now is the opportunity to reset the common sense on what is. And it's like, well, no, you didn't do it. And I don't know. I guess maybe this is part of my internal tension about like what kind of public intellectual ought one to be. To the extent that I'm public, what kind of semi-private intellectual should I be? Because there's the fun of being a provocateur or being, a parrhesiast. And I mean, part of what I enjoyed about Tablet is they gave me a lot of freedom, except for one time when I made fun of Barry Weiss. They were like, I said, Barry Weiss loves free speech, except when she was a Columbia student and tried to shut down her pro-Palestinian professor. And they were like, that was very complicated. That was a nuanced situation you don't understand. Like, okay, all right. Where was this going?
Well, I mean, I'm saying it's always worth critiquing the left, particularly in times when we can look backward to 2008, but also in the moment, right? In 2020, when there was this historic kind of alignment of forces behind some project, broadly speaking, of racial progress or something like that. And you can imagine a sort of alternative timeline in which instead of coming with like, DEI seminars and defund the police, they actually came with like meaningful programs that would actually materially and in all sorts of ways advance the project of racial justice.
Did nothing. I mean, how much better would that have been?
Well, I mean, I think it would have been better, and that's an extraordinary indictment. Had they done nothing, it would have been better than what they did do. And so I'm saying, like, how can it not be useful to critique that these things will happen again? There will be another 2008. There will be another 2020. We need to work intellectually towards pushing the left to have a sort of workable project, to which I think your response was like, what would you say? It was ever thus or something like that. But if that's what you think, then toss the utility question out of the window entirely. Like what is utility if you think there's no point in like, where's the utility?
Well, right. So I guess I have a kind of guilty conscience here because, right, I'm torn between like just being a writer, like enjoying writing and wanting my writing to be like free and fun and I mean, I do think, with no false modesty, I do think I had like one of the most interesting styles. Like, I mean, I think like the sort of writing that I was doing there in Tablet, I don't think anyone else can do what I do.
No, I agree.
On the other hand, that's not very effective for speaking to the left. And even, part of my wish in the past couple of years is I've been thinking more particularly about like kind of gay guys like myself, right? Like I'm sort of trying to write for them. I had so many conversations with people who are, somehow similar to me demographically in academia and journalism, whatever, who were like, oh, I agree with this or that thing that you say, but I don't want to be on the same team as Andrew Sullivan, as Ron DeSantis, as whatever. And the tension between like, I want to say something fun and provocative, but then if you say that, then like someone who might timidly agree with the rational version of what I've said is like, oh, no, I must separate myself from that.
It's funny, that's because that's such a tension in your work, right? So on the one hand, you're writing these things where you've adopted this sort of clever, smart rhetorical strategy where you're trying to differentiate your classy critique from the sort of vulgar critique, right? In some sense, sort of strategically, in the interest of giving readers the opportunity to attach to your critique without. And then at the same time, you're utterly sabotaging that with all of these just ad hominem attacks on random people or like...
So, I mean, case in point, like, so I love this gay writer, Christopher Brown, who's like a pretty good novelist.
Hey, so this is the free teaser. If you want to hear the whole thing, you know what you have to do. You have to subscribe, at least for this month, and send some moolah my way.